As someone who's obsessed over how their life could be different if they made different decisions or just got different circumstances, multiverse stories are kind of dangerous territory for me. But since my middle name is Danger Man, hyphenated, I love them. They give the main character of a story a reason to think about themselves through this idea that there's a world where they made different decisions or lived under different circumstances and turned out much differently. That's right, our word of the day is different. So I've been happy for the last couple of decades because there have been lots of multiverse stories. The peak of the multiverse craze for me, and probably a lot of people, was Everything Everywhere All at Once, because we all wanted to live in that world where there were hot dog fingers. However, the chance to see how iconic heroes would have ended up under different circumstances has been capturing the attention of movie audiences, TV audiences, and comic audiences. Lots of comic audiences. For decades. More decades than the decades I a lot more decades. This is a professional channel, we definitely scale things here. Spider-Man's had a lot of stories in all three mediums, so much so that a lot of you might not know what a multiverse is until I refer to it as a Spider-Verse. But out of all the generational heroes that have discovered new worlds over the years and had different iterations across a multiverse, Garfield is the one I had. And I assumed that I, William, wouldn't just have any old stupid story. So that made his 9 lives an important story. Garfield, His 9 Lives was a graphic novel from 1984, put together by Garfield creator Jim Davis and the artists he was working with at Paws Incorporated. The story revealed that the newspaper juggernaut was actually the 8th in a series of 9 incarnations. He was given these lives as a show of favoritism from God, who was a cat. Not much information was readily available about the book and the making of it, other than the fact that it was the product of many all-nighters by the artists and writers involved. If you've ever seen the Community outtakes, you know how weird all-nighters can get.
Hey, listen for me. Sending Morse code via her clitoris.
As a result, His 9 Lives has gained a reputation for how it stands out in the otherwise very brand-friendly stories of Garfield.
Garfield, His 9 Lives. An absolutely bizarre piece of fiction. This is an actual picture from the book. Hey, nice to see you, Garfield.
You know, I'm getting the unbearable urge to say that I did just come across this in the research for the video. I wasn't just watching Family Guy. But then I feel like it would be a little bit fake of me to come out and say just that, because I did watch a lot of Family Guy for all the seasons that Seth MacFarlane wrote for, which was up through season 9, I think. But that's not, I didn't stop because he stopped. I stopped being a teenager. Then again, it might be cool to not like Family Guy now. Maybe it was always cool. I think it is cool. I think, yeah, fuck Family Guy. I'm just playing Family Guy, you know I love you. It also provided a pretty good jumping off point for the do's and don'ts on writing alternate takes of characters. To be clear though, we are focusing on the type of deity who lives multiple separate lives, not one continuous life that is made up of multiple separate incarnations. Less Doctor Who, more Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's only important because we have to power scale Garfield correctly. A Garfield who could survive death would possibly become an amorphous demon destined to consume the entire world and the universe thereafter. I used to wonder what Jim Davis thought of the sumbitch who turned Garfield into a horror story, since Garfield being creepy as anything has been around almost as long as the internet. Turns out, Jim Davis was the sumbitch! Sumbitch! He had Garfield sending old ladies to their graves in 1984. Which is part of how His 9 Lives gained such the strange reputation it did. For the most part, Garfield has been the poster boy for brand friendliness. Literally, every high school, middle school, elementary school, all the schools I went to had him in all the classrooms and all the halls, in some way or another telling you to learn better. And the brand friendliness wasn't an accident. Davis told Walter Shapiro he made an effort to keep the gags broad, the humor general, and applicable to everyone in an interview for People magazine in 1982. The interview will be kind of a tangent here since it doesn't specifically mention Garfield His 9 Lives. But the way the interview plays out kind of revealed to me where all this weird stuff might have come from. Shapiro wasn't pulling his punches with the questions, asking Davis if his broad style made Garfield for the lowest common denominator. And when Davis admitted he felt the character was getting more depth every day, Shapiro replied, "Forgive me, I read the strip daily, and I'm not sure I see the depth." Davis conceded, maybe the character's a little bit static, but doesn't give in completely, saying, but then, all at once, a tiny little aspect of his personality will come forth and give me some new material. What made that quote most interesting to me was that in the foreword for Garfield His 9 Lives, we're told the book came to be because there were elements of Garfield's complex personality that allowed for more stories than a 7-inch newspaper format will allow. I'm not claiming Davis wrote the book in a specific reaction to this interview, but I do think that the criticisms in general were swimming around in his mind already. The book felt like a response to the idea that Garfield was nothing deeper than a cute cat you could put on a backpack or lunchbox. A chance for Davis to shine a light on the complexities of the character. So what were these complexities we were finally unlocking from the creator? Well, they break into 3 separate categories in the book. What if Garfield looked different? What if Garfield was a different genre? And what if Garfield was terrifying? Stories revolving around if Garfield looked a little different took up the majority of the book, with 5 of his 9 lives falling into this category. The story's humor and character feel very, very similar to a normal Garfield story. Cave Cat saw Garfield live his first life in the prehistoric era. Exterminator saw him live a life as one of the 3 Stooges, and Space Cat saw a version of him that lived in the future and hogged video games. For the most part, Garfield acted the same as how he does in the weekly comic strips, although Exterminator's Garfield did seem a little bit more proactive. He had a full-time job, he forced an old lady to eat a rat. I'm just saying, I wish I had that kind of drive. But keeping a character mostly the same can be true for a chunk of stories written in alternate dimensions or different lives. A lot of stories only change the circumstances around the character because the point is to show how the character would act under new circumstances. Even if it doesn't really let us know anything super new about the character, it gives the audience a hook for keeping up with the story and caring about what happens. But it's a tricky line to walk too. If things are too familiar, the story kind of misses the point of trying to be different. This was how Vikings felt, where Garfield was a Viking, but he spent most of his time in the modern day with a haircut, basically making him normal Garfield. Which kind of worked against the whole idea of Garfield being complex, if he was going to start out very different and then just kind of revert back to normal. Turns out Garfield would shed more interesting characteristics in order to just be Garfield, although he does revert back to a Viking at the end of the story. This also implies that there's 2 Garfields living at once, since the Viking Garfield doesn't live in Viking times, he lives in the modern day, and so does Garfield. And if there's that cat from A Tale of Two Kitties that looks like Garfield in this world, that means there's 3 Garfields? Yeah, one of the lives in here is just normal Garfield in the modern day. Though it wasn't actually the main timeline Garfield. In this universe, John adopted Odie because he thought Garfield needed a friend, rather than Odie originally belonging to John's friend Lyman. The protectors of Garfield canon must have been furious, if they're real people. It's not uncommon for creators to change things up a little bit when revisiting a story. Like Spider-Man, since all 3 main movie Spider-Men were basically the same person in a slightly different font, when they did the origin story the second time, they made it more secretive and intriguing and focused on different elements of Peter Parker's past, and then they just skipped it entirely the third time because we know what happened now. Fair warning though, changing small details can only work for so long. Batman's a few movie incarnations ahead of Spider-Man, and by Robert Pattinson's incarnation, people were running out of things to say Batman hadn't been yet. Okay, sure, he's been a detective, a brawler, a god fighter, and a camp master, but he hasn't listened to Nirvana yet. So in this graphic novel, the Garfield stories that switched out his normal genre for something different provided some fresh air. The garden was basically GIFO, Garfield in face only. He pranced through a strawberry shortcake land with his best friend, never disobeying any rules ever. It was definitely not normal Garfield. I'm not really sure who it was, or who it was for. And honestly, the relentless optimism and kindness makes me very suspicious. Babes and Bullets, on the other hand, threw Garfield into a detective thriller to pretty great success. It felt like the writer balanced the idea of a parody of a detective in a noir with a character who's still true to Garfield well. Babes and Bullets is the story I felt delivered on the premise of the book the best, as it felt the most like what Garfield would be like if he lived in completely different circumstances. Kind of reminds me of the Dreamland seasons of Archer, where the main character dreamt up different scenarios where he and his friends were there, but they were playing different characters with different motivations and slightly different personalities. Though Archer did make a much clearer attempt to connect all the characters because it was a TV show with a cast. Garfield was the only returning character in the Sam Spade story because canonically, cats are the only ones who can live 9 lives due to God's favoritism. Besides, I wouldn't really want too much of the cast of Garfield in the rest of these stories anyways. They benefit from not having anyone we care about in them. Lab Animal fell between the categories, what if Garfield swapped genres and what if Garfield was terrifying. Garfield was being experimented on in a lab, he got this needle shoved in him, but he escaped and attacked a guy, and the guy was dead, I think. But with no time to think on that, he runs from the dogs, and then he goes up a tree, and then, of course, he has the most terrifying transformation ever into a dog, because I guess that's what they were doing. They were turning cats into dogs. I knew it. People need to wake up. We were fighting each other because it's a distraction from the fact that they're turning the cats into dogs, okay? So wake up, everybody. The reason I said it fell between the two genres is that the story itself is kind of more a thriller than it is actually terrifying, but that transformation was creepy as anything, and one of the things that I remembered about the book from my childhood. But at least Garfield wasn't the aggressor, like in Primal Self, which was the one where he became possessed by demons and then went to kill this old lady. I'm not even sure demons is accurate. These were like cosmic horrors. I'm pretty sure Garfield was dead at one point. Also, who had beef with their grandma at Paws Inc? One old lady was force-fed a rat, another one was killed. Somebody didn't have fun at Christmas dinner that year. Honestly, since these creepy parts are the parts of the book that most people seem to remember, I thought there would be more of them. His attack on the old lady was probably the most memorable page and passed around page of the book. These types of alternate live stories stick with us because of how jarring they are in compared to the source material. Oftentimes, these are the stories that treat their source with the least reverence, because it's more about taking the name of face of something that gives you comfort and then using it to terrify you to the bone. There's got to be an audience for it, because every time something enters the public domain, the first thing that's done with the property is it's turned into a B-movie horror. There doesn't seem to be any meaningful attempt to connect with Garfield in these scarier stories, but maybe that's the point. After all, a lot of the things that feel familiar and warm to us can turn sour and cold overnight. Maybe stories like these help us prepare for that. make us feel safer in the long run. If you just heard about the book and you're thinking, wow, William, they sure did stretch old Garf pretty thin, you haven't seen thin yet.
You say you're born under a bad sign.
4 years later, in 1988, the book was adapted into 2 TV specials, one that was a full adaptation of the entire book, and the other that was a extended special for the detective Sam Spade.
All that I ever was made me what I am in my 8th life. Somehow, it's falling short of my expectations.
It seemed like by this point, Davis and company were ready to take Garfield a little further out of his comfort zone. So they took out 2 of the stories that were what if Garfield looked a little different, and added 2 new ones that switched Garfield's genre. Stunt Cat was still a comedy, but it switched out Garfield's personality for a regular cat with a terrible job.
Action! That's a wrap!
Piano Cat, on the other hand, almost made me cry.
Diana managed to get down onto the keyboard. She laid down, put her face on her folded paws, and quietly passed away.
I had to pause it and collect myself, which was something that I swore I would never do for a Garfield adaptation. And I let that little boy collecting himself in the theater bathroom in 2006 down. They also replaced the story where Garfield was a Viking with a story where Garfield was the Pharaoh's cat, which taught me that Garfield would abuse a lower class in order to make his life more needlessly delightful.
Did I ever tell you I love it when you grovel?
They also took mercy on our souls and didn't adapt Garfield killing the old lady, though they made up for it by having the body transformation and primal self become straight up body horror. Garfield also had to produce a concerto under the threat of death and ended up inventing jazz in the process. He canonically created jazz, or at least had precognitive abilities and was able to steal jazz before it was invented. Don't worry, I checked, Robert Zemeckis wasn't involved with this. Space Cat was no longer about Garfield being in a video game. This time, he actually died in space.
Heroes don't die. We always win our space battles.
Which led to the most interesting aspect. At the end of the special, Garfield is brought before God and is able to bargain his way into giving him and Odie 9 more lives.
Then so be it. You both have all 9 lives.
This is what I'm talking about. This alternate universe story gave us a version of Garfield that allowed us to see that he's so cunning he could bargain with God, and that he cares for Odie so much that he would get him the powers of a cat. Sorry, that's just, I'm very jealous. Everybody knew Garfield secretly loved Odie, but hey, now we have this, him granting Odie 9 full lives. That's, really good proof. The Sam Spade adaptation was an interesting case. Pun intended and regretted. The original story had the least pictures of the entire graphic novel, because it was parodying detective novels as well as, noir movies. So when it came time to adapt it, the team did a really good job of creating visuals that matched the tone of the story, and the soundtrack sold the whole thing.
An empty bottle of milk lay on the floor next to the couch where I had a business engagement the night before.
Also, as much as I like the more realistic look that the graphic novel had for Sam Spade, I do enjoy seeing Garfield in the trench coat and hat. The big negative was that, for whatever reason, Sam Spade hooked up with a human woman.
You ask too many questions, Sam.
In the original story, all the other characters were animals as well, including the assistant that Sam Spade hooks up with at the end of the story. But in the animated special, Spade is the only one who is a cat, and every girl he flirts with and the girl he eventually ends up hooking up with are all human women. What are you gonna do to the cat? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, the special was all in Garfield's imagination. It wasn't one of his canonical lives. And you'd be right. Sam Spade, in this dimension, was not one of Garfield's lives. He was something Garfield imagined when he saw a hat and trench coat.
Getting ready to roll the credits, pal.
So technically, he never hooked up with anyone here. But I don't know, it seems a little bit weirder to me that canonically Garfield is attracted to the idea of hooking up with a human woman. I'm eyeing him a little different now. So if I've learned one thing today, it's that Garfield stands tall as a case study for cross-dimensional beings that have eldritch powers and can communicate with God. Which ultimately, as God said, made for a good story. I actually really liked the core premise of this book. I've kind of seen the love for alternate dimension stories die down in recent times, with people getting more sick of it now that we've had a lot of it. And one of the ways that I've seen the stories grow stale is that they use alternate dimension versions of characters as basically excuses to do whatever. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, a lot of people felt like the alternate dimension team, the Illuminati, weren't utilized well. Part of that, for me, was that they weren't really there to say anything about the characters involved. It would be hard to introduce a whole bunch of alternate dimension versions of characters and establish how and why they're different and what their motivations are. But as a big Fantastic Four fan, there had to be a middle ground between a lot of exposition and making the world's smartest man act so dumb. Maybe if they had thought more about what they could say about the characters through this different world, they would have ended up with a more compelling story. Since I'm not sure one could fail taking cues from Garfield. Although the problem I had with that plot I also had with some of the stories in the book and the special, ones where it didn't really feel like it was Garfield, it did feel like it was just a cat. There's sweet stories about a cat, but I can't imagine Garfield ever being anything like this. If he was a real cat, he would be one of those terrible cats, one of those unholy furry terrors. Still, using different versions of a character to deepen and explore a mainstream version of a character is an interesting concept, and I think it's well executed in a lot of these stories. More like the way that Spider-Man No Way Home used the alternate Spider-Man to tell different stories about those two characters while also telling us more about our main version of Spider-Man for this series. Come to think of it, have we ever seen Garfield and Spider-Man in the same place at the same time? He's come up a lot this video, and Andrew Garfield. Hold on, I think I have my next video. I'll see you guys later.